Okay, hi everybody. I'm Lisa and I'm with Indivisible Twin Cities. And we have with us today the Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon. And good morning,
Good morning.
Secretary Simon.
Thanks for
I'm
the
glad you
chat.
could. Yeah. Um, we're here because we are getting a lot of questions from our membership. We see it on social media and in our emails and at meetings, where people are really um, I think they've got a lot of questions about the SAVE Act, I had to write it down, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. And they want to understand what it is, if they should be concerned about it, and if it's bad, why is it bad? And we thought you were the best person to explain it.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. I want to thank Indivisible and everyone else who is really focused on this issue. They should be focused on this issue because the SAVE Act really is an unforced error if it were to be implemented. It would be bad for our election system. It would introduce a lot of chaos. And maybe most importantly, it would shut out potentially millions of eligible voters. Eligible. These are people who are 18, they're residents, they're citizens, eligible voters who would be shut out. So let me boil it down to the one central thing. The SAVE Act is national legislation that would impose upon all states and all Americans a requirement to produce documentary proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. Documentary proof, meaning documents, paper that you have to show that demonstrates that you're a US citizen. Now, that's a problem, but I understand, let me just say right away, I understand why on the surface, a lot of people might think, hey, that doesn't sound so unreasonable. I mean, being a citizen is one of the things you have to be in order to vote. So why not make sure that people have to prove it with paper? So I understand that on the surface, it's got some appeal, but it's one of those examples where the more you look, the less you like. When you really look at what this means, when you really look at just from a common sense, everyday perspective, how you'd implement something like this, it starts to look very, very different. So let me give you one particular statistic that I think makes a lot of people turn their heads a little bit. We have 69 million women in America who have a different last name today than their last name at birth. Presumably, in the vast majority, these are folks who married and took their spouse's name. So, what do you do with them? Well, if you have a passport, you're okay because passports are documentary proof of citizenship. But if you don't have a passport, which north of 20 million of them don't, then how would you show that you're a citizen of the United States of America? And by the way, let me pause here to say there is no master list of US citizens. If there were, that might make this a lot easier call. But there is no place in Washington, D.C. or any place else where there's some ongoing master list. Here's the list. Here's who everyone's who's a U.S. citizen. That doesn't exist. So back to the person who might have changed her name since birth. What does she do if she doesn't have a passport? Well, presumably she'd need to do not one thing, but two things, not one set of documents, but two. She'd need to go and get and produce a birth certificate, but that's not enough, right? Because that birth certificate would show another last name. Instead, she's got to get a birth certificate and some sort of marriage record, both. And that's only if she's been married one time. What if she's been married a second time? So when you think about it in real world ways, this would introduce just a ton of chaos. Just imagine the person in that situation, maybe someone who's voted for a long, long time and now is put in the position of having to hunt down a bunch of documents. It's going to have the predictable result. And we've seen in other states what happens when they do this. The state of Kansas is a really good example. So about, 12, 15 years ago or so, the state of Kansas tried this just within Kansas. They said, hey, in the state of Kansas, from now on, we passed a law. You have to show documentary proof of citizenship just to be able to register to vote. A court ultimately struck that down, but in the interim, they did have that for at least one election. And you know what happened in the state of Kansas? 26,000 eligible voters. Eligible. They were 18. They were citizens. They were residents of the state of Kansas. They met all the key criteria. 26,000 of them were turned away and shut out. Now, in the state of Minnesota, we're a lot bigger than Kansas. So if you sort of do the numbers there, you're talking about many tens of thousands of Minnesotans, maybe higher, I don't know, who would be shut out because they just couldn't come up with a paper. It's not that they don't meet the requirements, they do. But can you get all that paper? That's the question. So that's what makes it ultimately unfair, exclusionary. It would shut a ton of people out who are eligible to vote. They're good, upstanding, tax-paying American citizens who just want to have their voices heard, like maybe they've done for years and decades. So that's the problem with this SAVE Act, though on the surface, to some people, at least at first, it might seem reasonable. So that's the basic issue.
So this mostly affects it affects people when they go to either register to vote or they need to re-register to vote because they've moved, correct?
That's right.
Okay,
Exactly
so if you're already registered and you don't move,
right.
you probably are okay.
You're
But it's
probably
for
okay.
anything that either changes. You're changing your address
Exactly right.
or you haven't voted before and you're a new voter.
Or
Okay.
maybe you changed your name, right? That's another thing. Maybe you changed your name. And, we live in a pretty mobile society. A fair chunk of people move every year. A lot more move every 2 years or every 3 years, or for those who only vote in presidential elections, every 4 years, that number's even bigger. So the issue is this would affect people who are either registering for the first time or are re-registering because they had a name change or they moved and that kind of thing. And that's a lot of people. And nationally speaking, we're talking about potentially tens of millions of people who fall into this category. And let me mention just one other thing. I talked about introducing chaos. It's not just chaos for everyday folks and voters who are eligible to vote. The way this thing is written, nearest we can tell, it would impose a lot of chaos on the people who actually run elections. Not as much on our office, in the Minnesota Secretary of State's office, but in the counties and the cities and the local government. They are really running the show when it comes to voter registration. They're the ones who input the data, and we're putting them in the position at the registration phase of being sort of referees about what documents are good or not, or is this a real birth certificate, or is this a real marriage record? And it's putting them in a position that they're not trained to be in and they don't really want to be in. Let me give you one other example. This is a real world example. I won't name this person, but there was a former legislator in Minnesota, in the Minnesota House, who would sometimes give this example. His actual birth certificate to this day says baby boy on it. It says baby boy and then his last name because they hadn't named him yet. His parents hadn't named him by the time he got his birth certificate issued. Now, I'm not pretending that's millions and millions of people, but he's probably not the first and probably not the last. So what do you do in that situation? What does someone whose birth certificate says baby boy or baby girl or something else that's not a name, some placeholder, what do they do? And again, I'm sure that's not a super widespread issue, but it is an example. What do you do at a county? What do you do at a city? If someone walks in that situation, is it yay or nay? Is it thumbs up or thumbs down? It's an example of putting them in a position that they don't want to be in and could lead to a lot of misunderstanding and at worst, shutting people out.
Well, and you could also see it where people would just say, "Hey, it's not worth it. I can't
Right.
get the paperwork," or so I just guess I won't vote, which I think
Right.
might be the intention. Um, so it's been passed by the House.
Right.
I looked. I was looking at this morning, and all the Republicans in the House voted for this bill, and four Democrats also voted in favor of it. But now it has gone to the Senate. So can you maybe explain a little bit about what the process is now with the bill and even what the chances are that it might get
Right.
passed?
Yeah, great question. And that has a lot of us scratching our heads and asking folks in Washington in the know about what the likely path is. So, for sure, this would have to pay a visit to the Senate Rules Committee. Now, the Rules Committee in the last Congress was chaired by Minnesota's own Amy Klobuchar. Now, obviously, the partisan makeup of the Senate has changed. So she's no longer chair of the Senate Rules Committee. She's on it, but she's not the chair. The chair right now happens to be Mitch McConnell. He stepped down as Republican leader after many years. But one of the things he got as a soft landing is he chairs the Rules Committee now. So it would have to go to the Rules Committee chaired by Senator McConnell. And I've heard conflicting accounts of how important he thinks this is or how serious he thinks this is. Um, as many people watching this know, there's a filibuster for policy matters in the Senate. There are ways to get around it on money matters, but on policy matters, you need 60 votes. And the makeup in the Senate right now is 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats or independents who caucus with Democrats. So you would need to break a filibuster, 7 or more non-Republicans to vote along and break the filibuster. However, some people have speculated that despite the existence of the filibuster and the need to get that supermajority, that it's certainly possible that this SAVE Act could be tucked into what is perceived as a must-pass bill. And now this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but every year, one of those must-pass bills that a lot of things get amended onto because it's moving and you want your legislation to hitch a ride on something that's moving and will pass. That bill is usually the national defense bill that has to be passed every year. I mean, that's a must. And so the question some of us are asking, and I can't say that I have an answer, is what happens if this gets tacked on to a must-pass bill? You're sort of taunting and daring people to vote against a must-pass bill because it includes a provision or two or three or 10 or 20 like this that you don't like, but the overall bill is very important for the health of the country. So I'll leave that to experts on intrigue on Capitol Hill to talk about. But I think the firewall in this particular instance, we who oppose this bill hope is the filibuster, that you need a supermajority, and they probably almost certainly don't have the votes to get that done. But that doesn't mean we can be complacent, because this bill, whether it lives or dies, is telling in more ways than one about what's really going on here. Though I understand the impulse to make sure, of course, which we all want, that the only people voting are eligible voters, this is not the way to do it. This is overkill. And you don't want to shoot at a mosquito with a machine gun. And that's what this is. There are other better ways to get at this issue. And by the way, if I may, let's talk about the scope of the issue. Because we all agree that we want only eligible voters to vote. I can't speak for any other state, but I can speak about what's going on in Minnesota. And don't take my word for it. There was a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas here in the Twin Cities who just last summer, so this is fresh, this is new data, this is very much in the here and now. Last summer, he published a study or an analysis of Minnesota voting records for 10 years, from 2014 to 2024. And then he released it in the summer of 2024. During that time, 13.3 million votes were cast in the state of Minnesota in all sorts of elections. So 10 years, 13.3 million votes cast. Do you know how many instances he found out of 13.3 million of someone who was not a citizen voting in the state of Minnesota?
I could probably venture a guess, but I'd rather you just tell us.
I'll end the suspense. He found three. Three.
You know,
Now, that's
I was
three too
actually
many.
going to say that. I was going to say three.
Three is three too
I,
many. The answer we hope
yes, it
for,
is.
all of us, is zero. All of us.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants someone who's not eligible to vote to vote. That's three too many. But let's put this in some just rational perspective here, right? I mean, 3 out of 13.3 million. It's pretty close to a speck. I would call that a microscopic level of misconduct here. And
Yeah.
the question is, in order to get at 3 people over a decade, that's not per year, that's over a decade. Do you want to put in place something like the SAVE Act, which will have the real world, practical, everyday effect of shutting out tens of thousands, maybe more, of actual eligible voters, so you can catch 3? I would say no. I think as a matter of common sense, most people would say no. Most people would say that's overkill. So I think that's the message here. Not to disrespect the stated reason for this bill, the stated reason, which is that, hey, we want only eligible people to vote. We all want that, and we should embrace that and talk about that, of course. But you got to look at the practicality and the common sense way that you implement this thing. And it's just not going to work out for tens of thousands of people who are eligible voters, law abiding, tax paying folks. And that's the message I think we got to get across.
So one question we've gotten a lot, and I've asked it myself, is we are under the impression that voting and the management of elections is under the purview of the states, not the federal government. So, and we're also very familiar with the fact that the Voting Rights Act has pretty much been gutted by the Supreme Court. So I guess the question is, if this were to pass, how does it change what happens in Minnesota? Um, because again, you kind of think, okay, well, you're our Secretary of State. It's your department that is ultimately responsible for these things. How does that affect what you all do?
Yeah. And you put your finger on a really important issue. The balance that we've had in this country for a long, long time is that, there are basic rules that are set in the Constitution, like how old you have to be, 18, right? That you have to be a citizen, all of that. But then when it comes to running actual elections, the Constitution, you can look it up, Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution says that states are in charge of the time, place, and manner of elections. Congress may step in from time to time, like they did in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, when Congress said, hey, states, I know you're in the driver's seat. I know the Constitution says you're in charge of time, place, and manner, but we're stepping in as the Constitution allows us, because we cannot have in this country any longer things like poll taxes and literacy tests and so-called character tests, because we know what you're doing with those. You're trying to suppress and shut out valid American voters based on race, ethnicity, national origin, that kind of stuff. So Congress has done that. What would this change for us? Some things would go unchanged. We would still be in charge of time, place, and manner. We would still have the spread out kind of decentralized system that we do in Minnesota, where our office has a role to play. We oversee certain things. But of course, as some of your viewers know, I'm sure, we don't count votes. We never have.
Mhm.
I don't think we ever will. That all happens in a spread out, decentralized way in literally thousands of places across Minnesota. Your friends and neighbors are the ones who are counting the votes, whether that's at the county courthouse or at City Hall or in the polling places themselves, the election judges, the poll workers. So that basic structure wouldn't change. What would change is the introduction into the system of a lot of chaos, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, as tens and tens of thousands of Minnesotans who are upstanding Americans who are eligible to vote would be shut out because they cannot come up with certain papers. It would put elections administrators in a really, really tough spot, not only being where they don't want to be and doing what they don't want to do, which is being referees or judges on what papers are eligible or not from maybe decades ago, a birth certificate and that sort of thing, or a marriage record. But here's another thing that we haven't talked about yet. In the SAVE Act are criminal penalties, not civil penalties like a fine or something like that, criminal penalties for elections administrators who get it wrong, who don't do it in the right way. Criminal. Now, nobody who signs up to work on elections signs up for something like that. They know that they've got to do their job. They know that there's going to be a punishment if they don't. They know that if they commit outright fraud, of course, there will be criminal punishment, and there should be. I support that strongly. But if they make a wrong call on somebody's birth certificate from decades ago, or their marriage record or records from a long time ago, and if they get it wrong, there could be criminal penalties. I don't think anyone signs up for that. So, in an effort on its surface to guarantee that only eligible voters are voting, this is overkill, and it's unnecessary overkill. There are ways that we can get at the same goal here without doing something as drastic and as much an example of overkill as this. And let me give you an example, because sometimes people will say, fine, well, if not this, what? Putting to the side for the fact that in Minnesota, it's a microscopic issue, 3 out of 13.3 million. Put that to the side for a moment. If we in the states could get more and better access to additional federal databases on immigration, on employment, on other things. If we could get our hands on data, we could do an even better job than we're doing now, 3 out of 13 million. 13.3 million. We could do an even better job now, all of us in all the states, red, blue, purple, doesn't matter, north, south, east, and west, if we got our hands on more government information. Now, as I said earlier, there is no master list of US citizens. It doesn't exist. But you can piece together through other databases information that would lead to people who, whether intentionally or inadvertently, end up on the voting rolls. As I mentioned, there were 3 people out of 13.3 million and 10 years in Minnesota who were found to have voted when they weren't citizens. But if we got more data, we could do that. This is overkill. This is threatening the freedom to vote for tens of thousands of people in the state of Minnesota and millions nationally who are, again, American citizens, upstanding, tax-paying, born and raised American citizens or naturalized, but they can't come up with the papers. I just mentioned naturalization. I had forgot to mention earlier. I was approached by a state senator who has a considerable number of his constituents who are legal immigrants, who are naturalized, who for decades have been naturalized American citizens. This is from the Southeast Asian community. So many came over here in the 70s and 80s, are fully naturalized American citizens. They took the citizenship class. They lived here for at least 5 years. They passed the citizenship test, including the English test, and they've been citizens for a long, long time. But some of them are up in years and can no longer locate their naturalization papers. He told me that it costs $700 to replace a certificate of naturalization. If you can't find it, if it got lost in a move, whatever, $700.
Mhm.
And a lot of them, since the time they got that naturalization paper, maybe in the 1970s or early 1980s, they've never had to really use it for much of anything. And maybe they can't find it. So he, on behalf of constituents, was particularly concerned about that issue. Either way, whether it's a birth certificate, naturalization, you're asking people to come up with certain papers that they might not have. They might have to come up with multiple sets of papers if they've been married once or twice or more. And there are better ways to do this. There are better, less intrusive, easier ways that won't introduce all this chaos to the system, just to keep on ensuring and get even better at ensuring that only eligible voters vote.
I could see this really having an impact on our current ability to have same day registration
Yes.
at the polling places. That would just create so much of a mess.
Yes, you're right about same-day voter registration. It would absolutely slow things down for a lot of people as we put election judges and others in the position of deciding whether someone's birth certificate that might say baby boy or baby girl applies, or that someone's marriage record is a real marriage record and that sort of thing. And you hit on one other issue. You reminded me of another one, which is as far as we, secretaries of state and others who have been looking at this can tell, it would severely hamper and in some cases end online voter registration. Before 10, 12 years ago, when we had the ability to register online, most people had to fill out a piece of paper and bring it somewhere or have someone bring it somewhere. And some still choose to do that. But a huge, huge number of people, majorities, now register online like we do so much else online. But it's hard for many of us to imagine how you could do that or do it smoothly or do it well when you have to show actual papers. It's not like giving a driver's license number, which you can do right now, or give part of a social security number, which you can do right now, or give a state ID number, which you can do right now. That's just giving the number. But if you had to bring in your physical driver's license, right, which you don't have to do now, but if now through the SAVE Act, you have to bring in a physical birth certificate or marriage record or multiple marriage records, I don't see how that works. I know of no place in the country that has done that where you can register now online. So that's something that we'd have to think about. And that's a convenience that people have become really accustomed to in the last decade or a half, not just with voting and registration, but with everything you do with government, getting a hunting and fishing license, filing your taxes, applying for, medical assistance, whatever it might be, let alone all the ways in which we're just doing business day to day, whether it's ordering food or anything else online. And so that would be a major, major crimp in the system, a system that's worked quite well for Minnesota.
Yes, it has. So we're all about action at Indivisible Twin Cities
Yes.
and getting as many people as we can to do as many things as they can with policies and legislation. So, what can we do, and what can we talk to our members about doing to try to get this stopped?
Well, you should continue to do what you do so well, which is organize. Organize, speak out, communicate. In the first instance, let our US senators know that this is important to you. I would wager that they're not going to need much convincing on the policy. I think they're where I
Hmm.
am, but still, I think it still helps. I get this all the time on a lot of issues. People will say, well, why should I email or call the office of office holder X? They're already with us. No, you should call, email, write, do what you can because it helps them. It backs them up to say, hey, I got X thousands of people of my constituents that were concerned enough, not just to talk about it or wring their hands, but to reach out to me. It helps them, it emboldens them. And
Yeah.
so I would say reach out to our two US senators, Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar. They're very likely to be allies on this. I'm sure they are, but that's one thing. And then, of course, reach out to other senators as well. They may not be yours if you live in Minnesota, but I think it's important that they hear from the public just how chaotic and potentially damaging this actually could be. So I'm all about, particularly in the legislative context, you got to make noise, you've got to be heard, you've got to show the colors, and it doesn't as much matter that they might already be with you. It doesn't, it doesn't. It's not a closed case just because they're not your U.S. senator. It's true that U.S. senators are much more likely to listen to their own constituents, but I think it does not hurt to send an email, give a call, write a letter to any U.S. senator. So it's a little early now to know where the sort of pressure points are because it's just arrived in the lap of the Senate, so we don't know its path. We know it'll have to go to the Rules Committee. Maybe there will be other stops along the way. Maybe there will be other procedural sort of pinch points. So it's a little early to know that right now. But I'd say start for sure with our two US senators and keep this issue on the radar screen. You're doing that by inviting me on here today. People
Mhm.
have to talk about this and buzz about this and be concerned about this. And so just keeping it alive as a conversation topic is one way to help. To know that you care about this, to know that people are watching this, that it's not going to slip through under the radar, and that you're keeping an eye on it. And so that in itself is a real service.
I'm glad you brought up the topic of contacting other senators because I've this is actually the second time in about a week that I've heard an elected official say that we can call people who uh, we are not we're not their constituents because
Yeah.
we've usually kind of had it's not a rule, right? But we usually tell people don't bother calling some other uh, representative who doesn't represent you because they only want to hear from their constituents. But I'm starting to hear a different message on that.
Well,
Is so can you just kind of go into that a little
sure.
bit more?
And this, look, I was a legislator. I was in the Minnesota House for 10 years. And
Mhm.
I want to be real upfront, as I hope I was earlier, which is, of course, an elected official is going to care a lot more about feedback from their own constituents, a lot more. That's true. But I can't say they'll care nothing about what others say. They will take note of it, right? It's not on the same level as a constituent, but it can't hurt, I guess is what I'm saying. If you had to prioritize energy and effort or dollars or whatever, of course, I would always focus on your own office holders. But if there's very little extra cost in just cutting and pasting and sending that extra email or one more
Yeah.
phone call, and if that's not too much of a burden, then it's not going to
Hmm.
hurt. You're not going to go backwards by contacting five US senators who aren't your own. It's not going to hurt the cause. It's a matter of, finite time and resources and all the rest, but it's not going to hurt.
Well, and I would think that especially if we were focusing more on leadership, you know, Chuck Schumer or like in this case, Mitch McConnell, since he's over the Rules Committee, that
Right.
that would make sense.
I think so.
Good. Okay, good. Well, I know you needed to leave a little early, so I don't want to drag it out too much longer, but do you have anything else you'd like to talk about this morning or tell us?
Well, the only thing is, look, we got a good thing going here in Minnesota. We've got a strong, healthy democracy. We've got a strong election system that is fair and accurate and honest and secure. Not perfect by any means, but really, really good. We just got news yesterday, good news yesterday, that Minnesota finished number one in America in voter turnout in 2024 for our youngest voters, ages 18 to 29. That is so, so hopeful to me because we have a tradition here in Minnesota of being top of the list. Most elections, we're either first, second, or third in every election going back a long, long time. And those traditions can weaken over time. This tells me it's not weakening. We have our youngest voters, ages 18, 29, who are standing out there confidently voting. Doesn't matter to me what their viewpoint is or who they voted for, but that they're out there making their voices heard. So that's good news. But those systems and those traditions need protecting. And something like the SAVE Act could introduce a whole lot of chaos and bitterness and anger by shutting out tens of thousands of people who are eligible to vote, and we can't have that. So I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank Indivisible, as always, for its excellent work in organizing, explaining, motivating, generating interest and attention and passion. It's what you do so well, and I'm honored to be a small part of it today.
Great. Well, thank you. I know you're busy, so have a great Friday and a great weekend, and I'm
Thank you.
sure we're going to have other opportunities to chat.
Thank you. Thanks for being great partners in the democracy business.
Thank you.